Okay, so Chris, thanks so much for joining us, because I know it's been a very long day and I know you're writing a book at the moment, so we really appreciate your time. And yeah, just wanted to, spend 15 minutes with you and the core team of XR America. The plan being that as we maybe onboard new people, that they can, have this recording shared with them as part of that onboarding process. So with no further ado, I'll hand over to you if that's okay, Chris. And the idea is the sort of, I guess, the moral imperative to revolt, and what it means to rebel. That's the sort of theme of the talk.
Well, the coronavirus is certainly going to lift, for many people, the veil that somehow the system is functional and capable of addressing the most immediate and urgent demands of the citizenry, whether that's the pandemic or climate change or the further consolidation of wealth and power in the hands of an oligarchic elite. I know Roger has said, and I really strongly support this imperative of reaching out to people who don't think like us. XR, like Occupy, I think is sometimes probably correctly been chastised for being too white. So, of course, it's about diversity in terms of color and ethnicity, religion, but also politically, that we have to talk to people, and I'm specifically focusing on Trump supporters whose politics may be very repugnant to us. Because these issues affect them and their families as much as they affect our families. There's that quote from Lord Salisbury that Saul Alinsky used to always use: there are no permanent allies, only permanent power. I think for XR to succeed, it's got to build coalitions that incorporate people whose particular views we find difficult, if not even repugnant. And that's hard. As a reporter, which is what I've done for most of my life, I have spent a lot of time with people whose positions are quite difficult for me to countenance. I wrote a book on the Christian right, and the title of the book was American Fascists, Christian Right in the War in America. But for 2 years, I was inside megachurches and at pro-life seminars and creationist weekends. And I took a course called Evangelism Explosion, taught by D. James Kennedy in Florida. And I excoriated the movement and the manipulation of despair by these megachurch pastors who remind me of Trump. They're narcissists, they're white males. They've grown fabulously rich, preying off of the despair of their congregations. But by the end of the book, I had a great deal of empathy for those people within the movement, although they espoused political positions, including homophobia and Islamophobia and everything else that I'm opposed to, virulently opposed to. But I had seen what a train wreck their lives were. I mean, in terms of sexual abuse and domestic abuse and bankruptcies and struggles with addictions. I see the movement as dangerous in the same way that I see the proto-fascist elements within the Trump base as dangerous. But I do think that if we are going to build a movement around climate change, we can't speak only to our own. That'll be the first thing. The second thing is that we can't get caught up in what's practical or what's going to work. If history is any guide, most resistance movements are either crushed or hijacked. Whether it's the Iranian Revolution or the French Revolution, I would argue the Cuban Revolution. I'm with Chomsky that Lenin and the Bolsheviks were counter-revolutionaries. They destroyed the anarchist Soviets, where the workers controlled their own factories and rebuilt or built a form of state capitalism centralizing power, and were ruthless about it. But nevertheless, and this, of course, is why I think XR is right about being so insistent upon nonviolence. We have to rise up because it's the right thing to do, and not worry about whether it's effective or practical, or the media is giving us good coverage. I mean, I watched the media pretty savagely mischaracterize the Occupy movement. In fact, as a former employee of the New York Times, I actually went to the editor-in-chief of the Times and said, you're writing the stereotype. These people are just flakes and hippies and drummers who smoke blunts. And I said, in fact, they're highly organized, and you at least do them you at least have to send a reporter down there for a day, which they did, to their credit. So there will be so many forces that will be hostile, especially if XR becomes effective, and the media will be at the forefront of that, along with liberals, along with the Democratic Party establishment, which once Barack Obama shut down the Occupy movement, immediately tried to hijack both the language and the movement itself. So you don't have any friends out there at all, including those wolves in sheep's clothing who pretend to be your friends. The liberal class, as Noam Chomsky has pointed out, it acts as a kind of safety valve for a capitalist democracy, in that it is willing to ameliorate some of the more egregious actions by the ruling elite. But it also is allowed to have its position, and here I'm talking about quote unquote liberals in the media, liberals in academia. It's allowed to have its position because it's used as an attack dog on the left. I've been a victim of it for many years. It's as soon as you question the values and motives of the ruling elite that you step outside that liberal framework. I mean, for instance, the perfect example would be George Packer. He writes for the New York Review of Books. He critiques the Iraq War now. He was a cheerleader for the war when Bush invaded Iraq. And the mantra goes something like this, we wanted to liberate the Iraqi people. We meant well, but, we made mistakes and it went wrong. Liberal apologists also did exactly the same thing during the Vietnam War. So I think it's important to remember that the liberal class, which will speak in the rhetoric of justice and climate justice, is in fact your enemy, and it is used essentially to discredit radical movements. In fact, they hate radical movements or detest radical movements even more fervently than the right wing, because radical movements, by their actions, call out their own hypocrisy and lack of moral courage. So you don't have any friends, not within the establishment. The class and economic divides, which have created very frightening proto-fascist movements, they're not unknown in Britain. It's not the same. The United States is far more diseased as a society than British society, but you have Nigel Farage and even figures like Boris Johnson, which pander to these elements. We are going to have to talk to them. And I found in the 2 years that I was with members of the Christian right, I was quite upfront with them about where I came from, that I grew up in the church, that my father was a minister, that I graduated from Harvard Divinity School, but that I came out of the liberal tradition of the church. And I didn't bullshit them. But at the same time, I listened. And that's really, in many ways, the key, the fact that you're willing to listen. And there will be things that they say, and there's no problem with, being firm about your own position, whether it's on homophobia or anything else, with them, I found, as long as you're willing to hear them out. And I think that's got to be an important part of the climate movement, that we can't, it's tempting, even comforting, to ghettoize ourselves into people like us, but it isn't going to work. It's hard work to step into communities where we feel estranged and where the views being expressed are difficult for us to hear. But I think that, certainly with the climate movement, we have to open, that kind of dialogue. So, I mean, that would kind of, I don't know that I have anything else particularly imperative to say, but I mean, those are a couple important points.
Thanks, Chris. No, thank you. And I know, and I promised it'd only be 15 minutes, so we won't do a Q&A. And
well, I can if people have a couple of questions, it's all right. I mean,
marvelous. Yeah, I did. That's part of the reason I said it, just in case you were to then come in with that.
I am trying to stay awake to edit my first chapter, but go ahead. Yeah.
No, we did. Well, I'm just going to add, I mean, we fortunately, we've reached out to the young evangelicals for climate action, and we're looking at how we can, partner and actually message together. So we think that'll be a pretty good start for us in that vein. So, but yeah, enough of me talking. I've had too much coffee. So has anybody got a question they'd like to
Let me just add on that evangelical. When I was at Harvard Divinity School, I lived in Roxbury, which is the ghetto, the poorest section of the city. I ran a church across the street from the housing project. Harvard didn't have an inner city ministry program, but Gordon Cromwell, very right-wing conservative evangelical seminary in Boston, did. And it was interesting, I took their inner city ministry course. And I had far more connection with those students, all of whom had to live in Roxbury for the semester, because it turns out we just talked about nuts and bolts. How do you deal with the guy who's selling heroin on your street? How do you deal with a pimp who's pimping a 14-year-old girl? How do you, and it was when we got down to that level that, in fact, despite our very deep theological differences, we actually were able not only to communicate, but to work together.
Dana.
One thing that we as Extinction Rebellion America have, as we set out with our launch into the country, is that there's already an established Extinction Rebellion US in our country, and there's a misperception that's really widely spread through that liberal movement. I would say radically left liberal for much of the leadership of the Extinction Rebellion US. And I'm curious if you have any advice for, as you were speaking about before, the difficulty of the left criticizing the radical.
Right, well, the more effective you become, the more you'll be attacked, and you'll be attacked most viciously by the left. I mean, I saw that with Occupy. And I felt bad, I was kind of the old father figure in Zuccotti. I was there a lot. And I mean, these guys men and women were so courageous. And they had a kind of exterior where they dealt with it. But because I spent a lot of time with them, I saw how it really unsettled them and made them question themselves. And that was the point. So I think it's important to understand who these people are and what they're about. I mean, I know that there's been disputes within XR about identity politics and all that kind of identity politics. It has been really hijacked by the ruling elites and by corporate power. I mean, what was Barack Obama? He was exactly what Cornel West called him, which was a black mascot for Wall Street. The whole notion that feminism is about a woman CEO or woman president. No, feminism, if you read Andrea Dworkin and second wave feminists, is about empowering oppressed women. And there are no shortage. I mean, I used to work in Africa, and you could find figures like Mobutu in the Congo who were black and were Congolese, but did the bidding of the Belgian and the French and the American colonizers. And so we do need people of diversity and color without question. But we can't, look at Buttigieg. I mean, this guy came from McKinsey, which is one of the dirtiest consulting companies in the country. And you can't support him simply because he's gay. I'm not comparing him to Rome, but I mean, the head of the brown shirts under Nazi Germany was gay. there has to be more than that. So that's an asset. I think, being a woman or being a person of color or, being from the GBLT community is unquestionably an asset, but it has to go beyond that. And I think that that kind of identity politics has been very divisive within the left and used quite astutely by the ruling elites to mask what they're doing. Because there are always people from any marginalized group who, in return for power and money, are willing to serve their interests. And in the end, it's about combating combating these structures of corporate power. It's about confronting structures, not individuals.
Thank you, Chris. Has anyone else got a question at this stage? Terry?
Yeah, Chris, first, very quickly, thank you for doing this. This is a very encouraging encounter, and the earlier call also. I was the one who asked the question about the inverted totalitarianism and the wages of rebellion and your famous paraphrase of Sartre. I don't fight fascists expecting to win. I fight them because they're fascists. And I'd kind of like to follow up on that a little bit, specifically with respect to Wolin's inverted totalitarianism. Democracy Incorporated, that book, if I read it correctly, and I used it in my doctoral work extensively, that book was written kind of as a look forward, if I remember correctly, as if this is what's coming, maybe. But my question is that a tipping point that we're beyond? Is that a Rubicon that we've crossed?
I would say I think Wolin, and you should go on YouTube. I don't know if you've seen my interview with Wolin. Yeah. I mean, Wolin felt we were pretty much there.
Okay.
He felt that what we were moving towards is a consolidation of unassailable corporate totalitarian power, but that the system was so decayed that he defined the current system as inverted totalitarianism.
I see. Okay. All right. That's a very helpful clarification. Thank you.
Okay. Anybody else? Yeah, please.
So two questions. So the first question is, how do we fight identity politics? How do we counter that? That's the first question. Second question is, what are some other groups other faith groups who we can possibly make contact with, and other than the young evangelicals?
So how do you, I mean, I used to tell the kids in Occupy, because I'd read the COINTELPRO documents, that, they had no probably awareness of how deeply the state had penetrated and monitored their movement, which it has with XR, and how effective they had found identity politics to be in terms of being disruptive to the movement. So, a lot of these, I mean, when Malcolm X was assassinated in the ballroom, the Audubon ballroom, there were 9 FBI informants in the room. They were all Black. And so identity politics has become a nice weapon in the hands of the ruling elites in order to muck up the movement. And, I find it kind of just I don't know what the word is. I mean, I just find the notion that, that if somebody comes out of a marginalized group, they are, and yet essentially, like Buttigieg, serve the interests of the ruling elites, they should have a platform because they come from that marginalized group. No. People who come from marginalized groups who actually stand up and speak on behalf of those groups and confront power. Hillary Clinton. I mean, for Hillary Clinton to run around and talk about women and families after being part of her husband's administration, which destroyed welfare, and 70% of the original recipients under that welfare program were children is appalling. And so I guess you counter identity politics by saying, yes, we do need people of color and different sexual orientation and gender and everything else and religion. And we need these people because they have perspectives and understandings that I speak as a white male American, you just don't have. I mean, what is it to be privileged? Privilege is a form of blindness. I learned that, having spent 20 years of my life in the developing world. And no matter how I speak Arabic, I mean, no matter how much time I spent in Gaza, and I spent a lot of time in Gaza, I would never fully understand what it meant to be a Palestinian in Gaza. I worked as hard as I could to understand, but there's always a gap. And the same way I teach in a prison, I'll never understand what it means to be a person of color locked in a cage, but I work as hard, but I respect that gap. I understand that as a white male in particular, there are just things that my own upbringing and my own privilege make it impossible for me to see. And so we desperately need people who come out of marginal communities for our own edification, and also because these voices have traditionally been marginalized or silenced. But to come out of that community alone is not enough. That's my point. There's a big difference between Condoleezza Wright and Jeremiah Wright. Jerry's a friend of mine. So that's the point. But the state will quite effectively use that. I mean, that's why transparency is our only weapon, because, they're sitting here listening to this. It's a waste of their time, but they're doing it. And we can't win at their game. Number one, violence. Number two, attempting secrecy. I mean, I was pretty tied to the Oakland Occupy movement, which got completely hijacked, largely by the Black Bloc, half of whom I'm convinced are cops. There are very dark forces out there that do not want us to succeed. And we have to be very astute about how they operate and what the mechanisms are at our disposal to hold them at bay. And one of them is identity politics. They'll use it. I mean, they found out in Zuccotti that, one person could have a block, and oftentimes we knew who the cops were. They looked like cops. And the other thing is they kept wandering around Zuccotti asking who the leaders were. That was kind of a tip off. And then they said they were all from Reed College, but they didn't have their student ID. And we have a picture. There's a picture of three guys getting out of the back of a police van a few blocks from Zuccotti, and they're all Black Bloc. I mean, the Black Bloc and Antifa is a little more problematic because there are parts of Antifa that are nonviolent. But I thought the Black Bloc was a very effective tool used by the state to discredit and destroy Occupy. And I was quite vocal about it, which meant that I was picketed by Black Bloc everywhere I went. And it was always the same. It was like a bunch of men. They tend to be white, male, suburban men in like $600 worth of knee pads and stuff. But they go up and down wherever my lecture was with signs, and they all read "Fuck you, Chris Hedges," which for me was kind of an indication of their political maturity. So you will have enemies purportedly on the left, and some of those people are sincere. That's what they believe, but you'll find the security and surveillance state will use them to destroy you, especially if you become effective.
And Chris, in terms of other groups that you've maybe come across that you feel could be worth reaching out to, other than the young evangelical, is there anyone that comes to mind that could be worth reaching out to?
Labor unions. I mean, we don't have many in the States anymore. I mean, I wouldn't cross anyone off the list. Yeah, I mean, how do you get into marginal communities? That's difficult because the white left, when deindustrialization was happening, had forgotten about the primacy of economic justice. So poor people of color were getting savaged, no jobs unless it was in the illegal economy, and then their police were militarized and they lost all legal rights, due process, habeas corpus, fair trials, 94% forced to plea out, draconian sentences, constructed by Clinton and Obama and others, and evictions, and all of the, the white liberal elite was nowhere to be found. So there's a deep and justifiable distrust on the part of people of color of a white liberal elite that was, worried about whether the sociology department had, at their university, an appropriate array of, races or genders or whatever, which is great. I'm all for that. But they had kind of written people off in marginal communities. And so there is, I know, because I teach in the prison, so I deal with these people twice a week. There's a deep and understandable distrust of the white left, because they weren't there when these people were, really being decimated. And that's going to take a lot of work to repair.
Thank you. Any other questions, guys, before we finish?
Quickly, Chris, I hate to take any more of your time, but I was the last time I was an activist in my life was in the anti-war protests and the civil rights protests back in the late 60s and early 70s. And one of the things I admired most about Malcolm X and the Black Panthers was the extent to which they went into the neighborhood and they built that trust that, exactly as you say, the liberal left had lost touch with. And I'm just wondering, that's not really what XR is about. We're about nonviolent direct activism in the streets, but how valuable do you think it would be if there were a function or a part or a slant to our activism to do that sort of thing?
All right, let me just historically draw a line between Malcolm and the Panthers.
Well, yeah, yes, I know.
There's a pretty big line there. I mean,
Yeah.
The Panthers never resonated in the Black community the way Malcolm did.
No, I know.
Because, Malcolm came out of a religious tradition, and even though the Black community is traditionally Christian, it was that religious orientation that I think made Malcolm so much more effective than the Panthers. I mean, that's a whole nother discussion about the Panthers and Huey and where that went.
It was just the nuts and bolts. They were both doing the same kind of.
But yeah, I think that if you don't have a relationship with people in those communities, you're not going to break down those walls of distrust. I mean, so I've been teaching in prisons for 10 years, but it's only now that I'm writing a book about prisons, because it's taken me 10 years to, guys, at least before Corona, have been, going to housing projects and interviewing the kids and the mothers of my students who don't want to talk, even though their sons or their husbands or fathers are calling them from the prison saying, talk to him, you can trust him. Even then, I have to go back to the prison and they have to call again because there's such understandable distrust, especially if you're white. So it takes a long time to build those relationships because these people have been burned, including the white working class, which I come out of on my mother's side, have been burned so often by do-gooders. But I do think building those relationships are key. And because it's really about trust. It's about, I mean, these people feel so often, and correctly so, that they're just used. So yeah, I mean, you're right in that sense that, I mean, that's not really XR, but that it is imperative that that the actions we carry out are such that they address or take into consideration and address the real needs of the vulnerable. And the only way we know what those needs are is to listen to the vulnerable. We may think we know what they are. I speak as someone who lives in Princeton and comes from a position of privilege, but we're wrong. I know, because I carry my assumptions into my books. I just wrote a book called America: The Farewell Tour, where I was with opium addicts, heroin addicts, and white hate groups like the Three Percenters, and addicted gamblers, actually in Trump Casino. I mean, that's kind of why I like reporting, because oftentimes my assumptions are just shattered. And I think that so often those people who seek to build social movements do not do a good job of listening. And that's absolutely key. And that is key for XR. They do have to listen. They have to go out and listen. They don't have to agree. To understand is not to condone, but they do have to listen.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Right. Well, yeah, we should do this every Friday evening, I think. But that's just my opinion. But no, Chris, thanks so much. Thanks for all of your time for XR today.
Sure. Okay. Thank you. Okay, bye.